நமோ ரமணாய நலம் பெற வாழ்க, விமோச்சனமெய்யன் விரை மலர்த்தாள் வாழ்க.
நமோ ரமணாய நலம் பெற வாழ்க, விமோச்சனமெய்யன் விரை மலர்த்தாள் வாழ்க. நமோ ரமணாய நலம் பெற வாழ்க, விமோச்சனமெய்யன்.
Papaji had, I think in his own mind at least, abandoned his family. He was staying at Ramanashram in, I think, July 1947, just before independence. Papaji said, I wasn't in contact with my family, I wasn't reading the newspapers, I was completely unaware of any political development inside India. There's one thing I want to say. Papaji said, I was addicted to Ramana Maharshi's form. He said, I was so in love with my guru, I took every opportunity to be in his presence. He said, I wanted nothing from him except to look at his form, to be aware of his form. That was my whole life was organized, getting an opportunity to stare at Bhagavan. And one little story which I love, he said at 12 till 2, which was his official resting time, devotees weren't allowed inside the hall, but Papaji said, I found a particular vantage point where I could see sideways through a window, not at Bhagavan, but he said if Bhagavan ever stretched a leg or stuck an elbow out, he said I could get one glimpse of an elbow or maybe one glimpse of a big toe. And he said that was enough for me. I could sit there for 2 hours staring at this window, and if I saw his big toe once or his elbow once, that would make my day. I was absolutely enraptured by the form. I was in love with Bhagavan. I was in love with his form. And one other interesting thing before I move on, he said in that state, when I knew myself to be self and I knew Bhagavan to be that same self, he said you can see very, very clearly who is and who is not enlightened if you're in this state. He said, I used to look at Bhagavan's eyes, and they would be unwavering, unblinking, staring out into space. He said, I would look at those eyes absolutely intently, hour upon hour upon hour. And he said, I never saw a single trace of a thought or a desire in those eyes. He said, I've never seen any other face like this in my entire life. I've been with great saints. I've been all over the world. He said, I've never seen someone who was as totally thought-free and desire-free as Bhagavan, and I saw that by looking at that man's eyes. And then he said, as advice, he said, my advice to everyone is to find somebody like this, someone who has absolutely no thought, no desire, to go into their presence, to look at those eyes, to be aware of those eyes. And those eyes, if you yourself can subjugate your own desires and look at those eyes of the Guru will put you into that same state of desirelessness. That's just an aside. So Papaji is saying, I was absolutely enraptured by Bhagavan's form. I didn't want to see anything else. I didn't want to be anywhere else. I wasn't in contact with my family. And then Devaraji Mudalia, who was the compiler of Day by Day, read in the paper that a boundary had been established in the Punjab, which meant that Papaji's family would be on the wrong side of the border. So because he knew Papaji wasn't reading the paper, he said, where is your family? And he said, Lyalpur. And Devaraji Mudalia said, they're on the wrong side of the border. There's going to be a lot of violence up there. You should go look after your family, make sure they get out. And he said, no, my home is here. I'm in love with Bhagavan. I'm far too attached to his form to go anywhere else. So Devaraji Mudalia kind of went behind his back and told Bhagavan that Punja, he was called Mr. Punja's family, is going to be marooned in Lyalpur. I think Mr. Punja should go back and get them out. So that's when this meeting took place on the hill. Bhagavan said, you must go and take care of your family. Papaji said, it's all a dream, I have no family. Bhagavan said, don't be afraid of the dream, go and do your duty. So Papaji left, went up to, I think it would have been Amritsar, the station in Amritsar, and he had heard that there had been massacres on either side of the border. The Hindus were massacring the Muslims were attacking the Hindus. Lots of people were being killed on these cross-border train trips. He said, I went to get in my carriage, and he said, suddenly I heard the voice of my guru saying, don't sit with the Hindus, go and sit with the Muslims. He said it wasn't a physical voice like coming down from the sky. Something inside me that I knew was my guru said, go and sit with the Muslims. So he said, I went and sat in the Muslim compartment. He said the train was stopped, and he said all the Hindus on the train were attacked, many of them were murdered, and I sat in this one carriage with the Muslims, and I was safe. And he had a big Om tattooed on his hand, and he said I was very, very surreptitiously trying to pull my shirt sleeve down to cover up the Om, because if the Muslims had seen it, I would have been next for the massacre. He got back to Lyallpur, collected, he said, 35 members of his family, and he brought them back on the last train that was leaving India. He said, as I looked behind the train, I could already see the mobs were breaking up the railway line, pulling up the lines. He said it was like a scene from a movie. We were escaping along the railway line that was actually being pulled up behind the train. Now, he said, I had a friend in the army who had gone to settle in Lucknow. That was the only place I knew. So we all went, 35 of us, we descended on this man. We all camped in his house. Because these refugees were mostly women and I was the only one who could go out and work, I had to go out and work and support all these people, which he did for the better part of 3 years. So right through till 1950, he took his obligation to look after his family very seriously. He worked round the clock and supplied enough food until they got a house of their own, one by one. The more distant relatives were sent off to other towns where they settled and got jobs. But he was the family patriarch. He was in charge. He organized the whole migration. He organized the resettlement of all these people. Then he heard on the radio that Bhagavan had died, and he actually saw this light in the sky that many people saw and knew that this was his guru passing away. He never had a chance to go back, but he said, inside, Bhagavan had told me, I am with you wherever you are. On their last meeting, he said, I knew that I didn't leave Bhagavan on the slopes of Arunachala, that who Bhagavan really is was who I really was, and that Bhagavan was inside me as my own self. He said, I missed the form because I was addicted to it, but I knew that I could never go anywhere away from Bhagavan, that Bhagavan was my own self, my own heart. I could never be separate from it. Now, around 1950, he'd got most of his family fairly well settled in various jobs. He thought that they could all manage by themselves, and he had this inner feeling that he should go back to Tiruvannamalai. He said, I just wanted to go and be there, be by myself, live a sadhu-y existence, and just be where my master had lived his life. So he came back to Tiruvannamalai, spent a few months being quiet, being peaceful, met a few of the old devotees, and then he, remember this right, somebody asked him about his family, and he said, oh, I'm not looking after them, I'm not sending them any money. And this man thought this wasn't correct, that he should be supporting his family. So he secretly arranged to send money to Papaji's family in Lucknow. And somehow he also arranged for Papaji to get a job in Bangalore. Papaji said, I went to Bangalore to meet devotees. I met this man there. And although it was never my intention to get a job, keep a job, I suddenly found myself working for a mining company. And the man who had hired me had found out I wasn't supporting my family, so he secretly started sending money to my family in Lucknow, and suddenly I was on the payroll of a mining company in Karnataka. So from about 1951 to 1966, he was working very hard again, supervising the surface operations of various mining operations in Karnataka and Goa. So he said, my job was to lay down infrastructure, roads through the forest, build houses for the workers, arrange accommodation, food, to collect all the ore that was dug out, to take it off to the port, usually Mangalore on the west coast, put it on the ship and ship it off to whatever destination it was going to. He said, I worked very hard, did my job very well. And then he said around the mid-1960s, when I was about 55 years old, I thought, that's it. My children don't need me anymore. Finally, I can retire. He said, in India, 55 is a respectable retirement age. Lots of people give up. So he said, I found myself on the west coast of India. And as often happens, he said, in my life, people started coming. I had a little center there. I started teaching. But he always lived a very peripatetic life. He said, I never wanted a big group of people around. I liked my freedom to travel. I liked to be unknown. So from 1966 onwards, he would spend a large part of the year just traveling around India, meeting people, having little satsangs. He never had a schedule. This was his trick to avoid people following him. He would never tell people where he was going. He would just arrive in your town, knock on your door, and say, hi, I'm here for a week. And then at the end of the week, he would go somewhere else, and he'd never tell you where he was going next. You could take him to the bus stand or the train station. He'd get on a train or a bus, but he wouldn't tell you where he was getting off. So for a long, long time, he lived a life of occasional meetings with devotees, periods with his family in Lucknow, and always long periods in the Himalayas. He absolutely loved the Ganga. He loved walking along the Ganga. He loved walking in the foothills of the Himalayas. So he gave himself several months a year when he would just roam the Himalayas. He would give himself family time in Lucknow. And for the rest of the year, he would flit from town to town all over India, meeting people who wanted to have satsang with him.
Namo Ramanaya Nalam Peravarga Vimochanamayan.
When I first went to Lucknow in the early 90s, his center there was just beginning to start a bookstore which stocked all of the basic Bhagavan books. Because I'd come from Ramana ashram, I was the designated supplier. I had to deal with the ashram bookstore. So over the next few years, I was ordering boxfuls of all the basic Ramana texts and resupplying the bookstore that was in Satsang Bhavan in Lucknow. But that was a later phase. I think when he started teaching, and quite late on until the 1980s, he wasn't someone who believed that you could get a lot from books, even those of his own guru, although he'd never tell you not to read them. Papaji taught that you get a direct experience by holding onto the eye, finding out where it comes from, and watching it disappear. In that sense, he was preaching from the same hymn sheet as Bhagavan, his guru, but he had a slightly different take on it. Ramana Maharshi used to recommend it as a rather intense, vigilant practice that took place over a long period of time. Papaji was more interested in showing you who you were in that particular moment with him through making you focus on this eye and actually helping you to take this eye back to its source and then revealing to you the experience that was already there once this eye disappeared. So Papaji wasn't saying go off and make this a long, continuous practice. He would say, sit in front of me right now and tell me who you are. Who is this I who is asking me questions? What is this I? Look at it, focus on it, watch it, hold on to it, and see what happens to it. Now, that there was something incredibly powerful about that man's presence. If you took his advice, and if you looked at yourself, at this I thought, sitting in front of him, with him looking at you, as often as not, it would go back to its source and disappear. So in a sense, you were getting a free lunch. You didn't have to put in all the hard yards of practice to get that experience. There was something incredibly powerful about that man's presence, about that man's gaze. If you cooperated with him, looked at your eye thought, watched it, held on to it, you could actually feel it subside and disappear. And when I first started going to see Papaji, there was almost an assembly line of people who were having illuminating, waking up experiences. They'd somehow watched their eye, seen it disappear, and become temporarily the substratum into which that eye had disappeared. You could see their face light up. If you talked to them, they'd talk a very Advaitic description of what had happened to them. Papaji told me once, he said, when people have this experience, you can actually see streams of light radiating out of their head. He said enlightenment is quite a good description of this, because there's a kind of firework explosion that you can see at a subtle level. People can't fake this. They get it, they have the experience, and there's this kind of light explosion around their head. So there was a long succession of people who would go up to him, talk to him, maybe argue with him, but ultimately he'd put you on the spot and say, who are you? Who is this I who's talking to me? Look at it, watch it, see where it goes. Don't let it join with any other thought, watch it. So he had a couple of, how shall we say, catchphrases. He said, don't stir a single thought. Watch this I thought, watch it disappear. And simply through the power of his presence, he could make your I thought disappear, and he could give you the experience that countless decades of practice sometimes never did. In that, I think he was almost unique. I know of no other teacher in modern times, at least, who had the ability to take almost complete strangers, park them in front of him, and say, look at your eye, tell me where it goes, and have them eradicate their eye temporarily and wake up to a direct but temporary experience of the self. That was his trick, his technique. That's what he could do all his life. And wherever he went in the world, he had this capacity to make people be aware of themselves. It didn't last in the vast majority of cases, but in a few cases it did last. He had this capacity to wake people up, and he had this capacity to make people happy. That was his double trick.
Namo Ramanaya nalam peravalda vimochanameyyan virai malattal.
This is a long story, and the best place to start it is several hundred years ago when Papaji said that he was a yogi in an ashram in southwest India, near to where the Sringeri mat is, on the Tungabhadra River in Karnataka. He was a Krishna devotee in that life, which is where he got all his Krishna vasanas, his passion for Krishna came from that life. He said he had a temple on the Tungabhadra River, and that he'd installed a Krishna statue there. And at one point he said, I had a dream when I was in that area. I suddenly remembered my last life. I went back. I suddenly remembered where my old ashram was. I went there, and he said, my samadhi from that life had been washed away by the river, but the statue I installed in that temple was still there. So he said, when I was the guru in this ashram, there was he said, I was a very old man. I was a celibate yogi. I was going into samadhi all the time, but there was a very young, attractive girl there who picked coconuts in my ashram. And he said, I was very, very attracted to this girl, but he said in that lifetime I was a celibate yogi, I behaved myself, but I did have a very strong attraction to this girl, which I did nothing about. So he had a very bizarre end to that particular life. He went into samadhi and was so deeply in that state, his devotees thought he was dead. And one complete lunatic, who must have been one of his devotees, decided to test whether he was dead or not by breaking the top of his skull with the tip of a machete. You know, what this was meant to prove, I have no idea. So Papaji said he was aware of what they were going to do, what they were planning to do, but he was so absorbed in his samadhi state that he wasn't able to stop them from doing this is he dead or alive experiment with the machete. And he said, I died from the blow from my own devotees. He said, I was buried in that ashram. The samadhi was washed away. Fast forward a few hundred years, and he said, around in the late 1920s, my parents started looking for a girl for me to marry. At that time, marriages took place at quite a young age. I think Papaji was 16 when he married, and I'm guessing the girl must have been a year or two younger. So he was married to this girl in the Punjab in 1929, and then when Papaji took this job in Madras, so he could come and see Bhagavan and got his final experience of realization, liberation with Bhagavan, he acquired the ability to see past lives, or occasionally they would reveal themselves to him. And he said he suddenly realized to his shock and horror that this girl he'd been married to for 16 years was the self-same coconut picker from his ashram 300 years before. And he said that's how it is. That's how samsara works. 300 years ago, there I was playing the great yogi. I was going into samadhi. I was mad for Krishna. But I also had this strong sexual desire for the coconut picker. So I didn't get enlightened. I got reborn. And who should turn up as my wife but the coconut picker I'd been lusting after 200 or 300 years before. So this was a bit of a shock. He said, I had some karma, some dramas to work out with this lady. We got married, we had sex, I had lots of children. But I don't think, either in the last life or in this life, that she was a very spiritually inclined lady. She was a very good person. The people who I talked to, who lived with her in Lucknow, said she was kind, generous, helpful. She was the sort of person who would bind a community together. She was always going to people on her street who were sick, offering them food, assistance. She was the local unofficial social services department of her neighborhood. She was a good woman who took her duties as a wife, as a mother seriously, but never really had the passion for God that her husband had. She did go to see Ramana Maharshi, of course. Papaji said, you must come and see this man. She went. And she admitted that she got very quiet, very peaceful with Ramana Maharshi. She wasn't a frequent visitor, but she was quite impressed with him. Now, Papaji wasn't home a lot. I think the karma with his wife ran its course. Notionally, they were still married, but over the 40s, 50s, 60s, he used to come home less and less and spend less and less time in his wife's household. He ran two houses in Lucknow. The first were his parents' house, his mother, the one who had been the big Krishna devotee who'd made him do all the Krishna practices. She was much more spiritually inclined. He used to give satsang in her house. And then there was his main house in downtown Lucknow, where his wife lived. He would go there occasionally. He would have satsangs there. But for a long time, whenever he was in Lucknow, he stayed in the house of his parents. I won't say he was estranged from his wife, but as the decades went by, she played a smaller and smaller role in his life. I don't think that she ever thought much of him as a spiritual teacher. She would watch all of these people come to the house. She would watch him teach. She was a very good provider. So when people come to your house, whatever the hour of the day or night, if you're the good Indian housewife, you make them some food, you give them a drink. So she never skimped on that. She must have thought it was a nuisance, people coming at all hours of the day and night. But she was always the gracious hostess. She always looked after everybody who came, and there were a lot of people. But I don't think she ever got who Papaji really was. She didn't understand why all these people were mobbing him. I don't think she felt any of the power that all these complete strangers were feeling on their first day. And one devotee told me that he talked to her one day. He'd had this great experience, and he went to her and said, "Oh, you're so lucky to have such a wonderful husband like this." And she said, I've sat with Ramana Maharishi. I know what it's like to sit with a wonderful teacher. I got quiet and peaceful in Bhagavan's presence. I never get quiet and peaceful sitting with this man, jabbing her finger at her husband. So I think it was a dramatic relationship. I think Papaji didn't have a lot of time for her in the end, because he was more interested in spending his time with people who cared about self-realization, who wanted to attain it. If you weren't on that wavelength, even if you were wife or family, he didn't have a lot of time for you. And I suspect his wife possibly felt a bit neglected, but she was aware of her dharma. She knew what her duty was. She knew what her responsibility was. She looked after all the people who came. She was gracious. She was hospitable. She was friendly. She was charitable. But I really don't get the impression from anyone I've spoken to that she ever really cottoned on to the fact that she was living with one of the greatest and most powerful teachers of the 20th century.
Namo Ramanaya Nalam Peravalda Vimochanameyyan Virai.
Now, last time I spoke, I mentioned that when Papaji first came here, he walked into the old hall and said, "Can you show me God?" And Bhagavan said, "I cannot show you God because God is the seer. God is not an object that can be seen." Now, Papaji said that after that particular piece of unwanted information, he had a rather extraordinary experience. I'll go into that later, but I found out about this experience because when I first met Papaji in 1992, I asked him a question which I had been researching at the time, and it was about the heart in Ramana Maharishi's teachings. Now, Bhagavan sometimes talks about this heart center on the right side of the chest. There are some well-known teaching statements on that, but there's a much less well-known teaching category, let's call it that, in which he very occasionally said that there was a kind of cavity, a very, very tiny hole in the spiritual heart, and that in unenlightened people it was closed, and that when full enlightenment took place, it opened and remained fully open. And as a kind of similar analogy, he said to Ganapati Muni that prior to liberation, there was what he called a downward-facing bud or flower of some sort, that upon liberation, this downward-facing bud went upwards, it bloomed and it opened, and at that moment, that was when you had full liberation. Now, this seems quite antithetical to a lot of other of Bhagavan's teachings, and I was never quite sure whether Bhagavan was just talking to people who'd done some Kundalini yogi, who liked these kind of images and metaphors. But there are enough scattered instances to indicate that sometimes he did talk about this, and he did seem to be saying that there was something quite physical in the body that opened and stayed open at the moment of liberation. So I asked Papaji about this, and that's when he told me about this first experience he had with Ramana Maharishi. He said, "I went there, I got this answer which I didn't like, and then Bhagavan looked at me." And this is what he wrote, or what I wrote down. He said, "Bhagavan's words did not impress me. They seemed to me to be yet one more excuse to add to the long list of those I had heard from Swamis all over the country. He had promised to show me God, yet now he was trying to tell me that not only could he not show me God, no one else could either. I would have dismissed him and his words without a second thought, had it not been for an experience I had immediately after he had told me to find out who was this I who wanted to see God. At the conclusion of his words, he looked at me, and as he gazed into my eyes, my whole body began to tremble and shake. A thrill of nervous energy shot through my body. My nerve endings felt as if they were dancing, and my hair stood on end. Within me, I became aware of the spiritual heart. This is not the physical heart. It is rather the source and support of all that exists. Within the heart, I saw or felt something like a closed bud. It was very shiny and bluish. With the Maharshi looking at me, and with myself in a state of inner silence, I felt this bud open and bloom. I use the word bud, but this is not an exact description. It would be more correct to say that something that felt bud-like opened and bloomed within me in the heart. And when I say heart, I don't mean that the flowering was located in a particular place in the body. This heart of my heart, was neither inside the body nor out of it. I can't give a more exact description of what happened. All I can say is that, in the Maharshi's presence and under his gaze, the heart opened and bloomed. It was an extraordinary experience and one that I'd never had before. I had not come looking for any kind of experience, so it totally surprised me when it happened. Now, I only ever heard Papaji tell that story once, and it was in response to this question about the spiritual heart. In Ramanashram literature, there is only one recorded instance of Papaji talking to Bhagavan, and that, interestingly enough, is also about the spiritual heart. After Papaji had this experience on his first visit, he had the knowledge, the experience, the conviction that the heart wasn't located in any particular place. So when he later came to discover that Bhagavan was speaking of the spiritual heart on the right-hand side of the chest, he went to Bhagavan and said, what's going on here? Tell me about this. So I'll just read that out because it's the only recorded instance of Papaji speaking with Bhagavan in ashram books. This is Devaraja Mudalia speaking, the compiler of Day by Day. When I entered the hall in the afternoon, Bhagavan was already explaining an answer to some questions put by Mr. Punja, a Punjabi. Bhagavan says, I ask you to see where the eye arises in your body, but it is not really quite correct to say that the eye rises from and merges in the heart and the right side of the chest. The heart is another name for reality. It is neither inside nor outside the body. There can be no in or out for it, since it alone is. I do not mean by heart any physiological organ or any plexus of nerves or anything like that, but so long as one identifies oneself with the body and thinks he is in the body, he is advised to see where in the body the I thought rises and merges again. It must be the heart at the right side of the chest, since every man of whatever race and religion, and in whatever language he may be saying I, points to the right side of the chest to indicate himself. This is so all over the world, so that must be the place. And by keenly watching the daily emergence of the I thought on waking and its subsiding in sleep, one can see that it is this heart on the right side. Now, there's something interesting for me about this particular answer, because Bhagavan is saying that he gives out this information on the heart center to those people who identify with the body, who need a specific location in the body to source it. I think he knew at this point, talking to Papaji, that Papaji had transcended his body identification. So he's saying, in effect, I give this advice out to people who are still identified with the body, and if they are in that state, then this particular sequence of information about the I rising from and back to this heart center is correct. But once you know, as I know you know, that the heart is immanent in all things, then it's no longer a valid description. So for me, reading between the lines, I think this is Bhagavan saying, I know you're in this state, we really know what the heart is. What I'm saying about the heart center is really for people who identify with the body. Now, I want to talk a little bit about just what a high regard Papaji had for Bhagavan. Couple of stories. I asked him once in Lucknow, I said, I was just not really joking, but just asking, do you regret anything you've done in your life? A lot of strange things have happened to you, some odd things that you probably wish hadn't happened. Do you have any regrets in your life? And he said, no regrets. And then about 5 minutes later, he looked at me and he said, David, I only have one regret, and that's that I'm no longer physically capable of throwing myself full length on the ground at the feet of my master. He said, I've got an old body, I've got diabetes. He said, I can't even put my pants on by myself anymore. If I want to get dressed, somebody has to help me. I really, really miss getting up in the morning and throwing myself full length on the floor at the feet of Bhagavan's picture. And there's a story that he told which is the source, I think, of his gratitude. Well, apart from the experience he had at Ramanashram, it shows you why he revered Bhagavan and why he had such love, admiration, and respect for him. He was sitting on the banks of the Ganga in the 1960s or 70s, and he said for no reason at all, he just went into a kind of incredibly long, elaborate vision in which he saw all of his past lives. He said not recent human ones, he just said it was an incredible list going over millions and millions of years. And he said although the experience in planet Earth time might only have lasted a few seconds or a few minutes, he said as he went through them all again, he actually felt he was having the full time of each birth. It just seemed an incredibly long experience. He said birth after birth after birth, animals, plants, people. And then he said after the last birth, he said a huge luminous picture of Ramana Maharishi appeared, and I looked at this picture and I knew that this whole sequence of births and deaths had ended by the intervention and grace of my master, that he had appeared and put an end to this interminable sequence of suffering, this interminable sequence of birth after birth. He said that is reason alone for me to have the feelings I have towards my master. He ended my suffering, he brought me liberation, and he severed my births forever. I never have to come back and suffer again. Now, there's one final thing that I want to read. In early 1990s, he was giving satsang to an increasingly large group of mostly foreign people in Lucknow. And one person came up and gave, what most people would regard as a very respectful greeting to him. And Papaji didn't like this greeting at all. And I'll read you the story, and this will be my final comment on Bhagavan and Punjaji, because I think this summarizes his relation perfectly. A few months ago, at one of the satsangs I conduct in Lucknow, someone gave me a note which concluded, "My humble respects and gratitude to you, especially to one who was a disciple of Ramana Maharishi." I got irritated. I couldn't let this pass. "Why do you say was?" I exclaimed. "Please correct your grammar. Please correct your grammar. I am his disciple. He is my master. How can I throw him away into the past? There is no past and no future for the master. There isn't even a present, because he has transcended time. When I left him physically in 1947, he told me, "I am with you wherever you are." That was his promise, and that is my experience. There is no one called Punja left anymore. There is only an emptiness where he used to be. And in that emptiness there shines the I that is my real reality, the I that is my master, the I that he promised would be with me wherever I am. Whenever I speak, it is not someone called Punja who is speaking. It is the I that is the Maharishi who speaks, the I which is the self in the heart of all beings. I tried to explain this to the person who sent me the note. I continued, "Who am I? What am I? I never think it is I, Punja, who am speaking. It is he, the Maharishi, the master, who is speaking. If I ever thought that this person called Punja was speaking to you, I would have no right to sit here, because whatever would come out of my mouth would be false. It is my own master who speaks. It is your master who speaks. It is your own heart speaking. It is your own self which is speaking to you. There is no one here claiming to be an intermediary. There is no one here claiming that he once had a master called Sri Ramana Maharishi. There is only emptiness, and in that emptiness the I which is, not was, my master speaks. I am sitting here introducing you to my teacher and his teachings. He is the teacher, not I. He is your own self. He is the teacher of the world. He was the teacher before you even knew him. He was there, waiting for you, smiling within your heart. Now you're attracted by him, not me. I, Punja, am not in the picture at all. Punja has gone for good, but the master remains and will always remain. He is seated in my heart as my own imperishable self, shining as the eye he alone is.
நமோ ரமணாய நலம் பெற வாழ்க, விமோச்சனமெய்யன் விரை மலர்த்தாள் வாழ்க.
நமோ ரமணாய நலம் பெற வாழ்க, விமோச்சனமெய்யன் விரை மலர்த்தாள் வாழ்க. நமோ ரமணாய நலம் பெற வாழ்க, விமோச்சனமெய்யன் விரை மலர்த்தாள் வாழ்க. அடிமுடிக்குண்டாய அநாதித் தொடர்பின் விடமுடியாமை மறந்து விட்டு